Hey everyone, in this video we're going to do some fun stuff, well, relatively fun, it is JavaScript after all. We're going to play around and mess with some of the default iterables in JavaScript. For example, I've run some code already, and now every time I make an array and I iterate over it, like this with a for of loop, console.log each color, we're going backwards. Green, yellow, orange, red, but the array is red, orange, yellow, green. Or another example, I've made it so that every time we try and iterate over a string, like hello, I'm going to spread it here. We don't get the characters, we get nope, 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 one for each character. So that's all kind of jokey, but also educational, I promise. But we're also going to see how to define our own custom iterables and iterators. The terminology is annoying in this video, I'll have to warn you up front, it's not my fault. So for example, I've created a range function which returns an iterator, and that iterator generates numbers, ranges of numbers. So we provide a start, like 15 to 50, that will be the endpoint, and then a step will be 5. So we'll generate every fifth number between 15 and 50, and then we can spread that and get those numbers. We could use a for of loop, or we can even try it with different numbers. Let's go 100 to 200 and get a massive array of numbers. We created a custom iterator, and we'll see how to do that by the end of the video. But first, we have to talk about terminology. We have to talk about what it means for something to be iterable. All right, so I just undid those changes to array and string. We're back to regular JavaScript world where arrays and strings iterate how they should. And if we take a look, I'm going to use the spread operator here to iterate. If you don't know about spread, last week I released a YouTube video on it, so check that out. Spread is going to iterate over an iterable, so like an array, here's an array, and spread each one out, in this case, into another array. So we're copying the data over into this array. So obviously arrays are iterable in JavaScript. We can do that, there's no problem. But why can I not do this? Spread of 12. I get an error, number 12 is not iterable. So how does JavaScript know that something is iterable or not? What makes something actually an iterable? Well, there's something called the Iterable protocol. There's also the Iterator protocol, which we'll come back to. Also, I should note, if you are familiar with generators or you've heard the term, they do relate to this. I'm not covering them in this video. I'll probably do a separate video on them. They are sometimes an easier way of getting some of this same functionality, but you have to understand iterables and iterators, or you should understand them before you move on to generators. So I'm kind of showing you the official protocols, and then generators often can be used to shorten some of this up, and they do it behind the scenes. But we're not covering that here. We're talking about the very important basics. But for something to be considered iterable in JavaScript, so that you can use a for of loop with it, or spread as two examples, this is the set of rules you need to follow to make something iterable. And really, it comes down to this right here. For an object to be iterable, it must have a property with the key of symbol.iterator. So if you don't know what symbols are, I also have a video on that from a couple months ago. I definitely recommend checking that out. It will help you understand why a symbol is useful here. I don't really have time to go into it, but essentially a symbol is a unique value. JavaScript could have used a string, so you had to, if you defined a method called iterate on every object you want it to be iterable, that could work, but it'd be very easy to overwrite that or accidentally conflict. But symbol.iterator is very, very explicit. It's something you do deliberately. So you must have that key on an object to be iterable, and then its corresponding value must be a function which returns an iterator. Now we haven't talked about what the rules are for something to be an iterator. There's a whole other protocol, lots of protocols, but let's just start with this first one. Symbol.iterator means that something is iterable. So if we come back here, as you've seen, arrays are iterable. So if I make an array variable, I'll just call it ARR equals 1, 2, 3. If we look at ARR, we go into the depths of the proto. Right here, there's a property called symbol.iterator. And it corresponds to a function, and that function returns an iterator, and we'll get to that. So what happens is anytime you try and iterate over an object, first, JavaScript is going to check, is this thing an iterable? So in the case of an array, it is, but in the case of a number, it's not. It does not have that property, symbol.iterator. But if it does have that property, then what happens next? Well, it executes that function. So if we wanted to try and execute it ourselves, to step through the process of this array, 1, 2, 3, I can access symbol.iterator, but I do have to use square brackets. Symbols are, think of it as like a variable. This is not the value itself. It corresponds to a unique value behind the scenes, so you can't use the dot notation. You have to use square brackets, and that gives us a function. So when we spread 4, 5, 6, 7, or 1, 2, 3 as an array, the first thing JavaScript does is it runs this function. Symbol.iterator, whatever the corresponding value is, it executes it. And that returns an iterator. So that's the other part of the iterable protocol. So if we save this to a variable, I'll just call this const iter, we now have an iterator, if I can spell correctly, right there. So we spent all this time so far just talking about the iterable protocol. And the whole point of that is basically to let JavaScript know this thing can be iterated over. This object supports iteration, but it doesn't define the functionality. It only returns the iterator. The iterator is an object that actually defines how something is iterated over. It's really annoying to say iterate, iterator, iterable over and over. So I did type it out. I'm hoping that this makes it a little bit clearer, but just know that this is not something that is second nature to most developers. It's not very straightforward, especially compared to other languages like Python. This is kind of a clunky approach in my opinion, but it works. So that function needs to return an iterator. We have an iterator stored in a variable. Now, what is an iterator? It's an object, and there's a protocol for it. It must follow these rules. It must implement a next method. And if we look at iter, which we stored, it's an iterator, you can see it has a next method right there. And that next method has some special rules. Every time it's called, it must return an object with these two properties: done, which is a Boolean, true or false, and value, which is the individual value that we are returning. So for example, if we're pretending that we are JavaScript and we're iterating over this array, we're going to execute the symbol.iterator function, and then we take the return value, which is an iterator itself, and we call .next. .next returns to us an object that contains 1 as the first value, and it says done is false. We're not done yet, there's more. So then next time next is called, we get 2, and done is false, and so on. And I can actually show this to you. I have iter. If I call next, the first value I get back is an object. It says done is false. We're not done iterating, and value is 1. The next time it's called, we get 2. And then again, we get 3. And then finally, we hit the end. Done is true, and value is undefined. So this is the standard protocol for every iterator in JavaScript. Whether it's a string, I could do the exact same thing I just did here for a string. So really quickly, if I did hello symbol.iterator.next, I'm just going to call it once. You see that the first thing we get is value h done false. It's an object returned from next. So when we loop with a for of, when we use spread, JavaScript is going to call the next function or the next method on that iterator over and over and over until it gets done true. So that is the protocol. It's weird, I know, but now that we've laid out the rules of how it works, we can go ahead and write our own iterators. Or to start, let's make all strings iterate and return a value of nope or LOL or a smiley face instead of the individual string character. So to do that, we're going to go into string.prototype. By the way, this is something you probably never will need to do. I don't recommend doing it. It's just kind of fun as an example to show you that the protocol is the same, whether it's on your own custom iterator or we're working with something like a string or an array. So string.prototype and then square brackets symbol.iterator. This is already a function. It exists. I actually just showed that to you, but I'm going to override it and make it my function. Now, if we follow this protocol here, it says the function needs to return an iterator. An iterator is an object, so we're going to return an object. And what's the next step? It must contain a next method, so we're going to add next. And then next needs to return an object with done and value. Now, this is the slightly tricky part. What we want to do is, let's say our string is dog. Next is going to be called one time, and we want to return, in our case, let's go with nope. So value will be nope the first time, and then the second time, value will be nope, the third time, nope, and then if it's called again, we want done to be true. So we need to keep track of how many times next has been called. So we don't write a loop, but we're kind of writing this to behave as a loop broken up frame by frame. Imagine this is a movie and we're splitting it up piece by piece, each frame, kind of the same idea. One iteration of a loop at a time, but we're not actually writing the loop in here. So I'm going to define a variable called count, and let's have it start at string.length. So this dot length, that's going to be whatever string this is being called with. So now length is 5, length is 3 on this, and we're going to start with 3 in our case, and then each time through we're going to subtract 1. So somewhere in here we need to do count minus minus, and then we'll check if count is greater than 0, because we're starting with 3 and then subtracting to 2 to 1, and then if it's equal to 0, we're done. So if count is greater than 0, we can subtract 1 from it, and we will return our object that fits the protocol, done and value. So done will be false, and value is just always going to be nope. Just like that. So then if we're outside of this, if this is false, that means we are done. So we can return done true. Just like that. And that should do it for us. Just a quick note of caution or warning here. Make sure that you're very careful about when you return done true. Make sure you do it. If you don't, you will iterate forever. Or JavaScript will continue to call next over and over and over, expecting to get done true at some point, and it will freeze your browser window and make your computer fan turn on and possibly ruin your life. It has happened to me many times. So let's see what happens when we run this. We start with count as 3 or some number. We subtract 1 each time. While count is greater than 0, we return nope, and then as soon as we are equal to 0, meaning once per every character, we return done true. So I'm going to run this, clear my console, and let's try spreading. Let's go with hello. There we go, 5 nopes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or let's do a console.log with a for of. For let x of doggy, console.log x, and we get 5 nopes. Not as dramatic because we can't see them all, but there's 5 of them. So that's kind of a fun example of how you can overwrite an existing or a default iterator. But next, I'm going to show you how you can construct your own from scratch, which is something you might do more. All right, so we're going to define our own iterable object called, well, range is a function that returns an object, and range will take a starting point, an ending point, and a step. So I showed this earlier on, but this should generate a range of numbers from 10 to 20 going by 2. So 10, 12, 14, 16, and so on. And we're going to start by defining a function called range. And it takes 3 values. We'll go with start, stop, let's go with end, and step. And I'm going to give them all default values. So if we don't pass them in, we'll go from 1 to 10 with a step of 1. And we are implementing the iterable protocol, which means we have to have a symbol.iterator property defined. So I'm going to return an object from this function, which is an iterable because it's going to have a symbol.iterator property, and that's going to correspond to a function, and this function needs to return an iterator. So that's an object. Next step, an object that implements a next method. Next, and our next method needs to return some object that contains done and value. All right, so how are we going to make this work? Well, you can think of it again as a loop that we break down into one frame at a time. So our loop would have some variable that begins with this value, whatever start is passed in. Let's go with 1. And then we continue to add step to that value until we hit the end. So we're going to have some condition in here that says if we've hit the end, then we're done. If we haven't hit the end, then add step to our variable. So I'm going to make a variable up here. I'll go with let current equals start. And then instead of next, we can add an if, and we'll say if current is less than or equal to end. If that's the case, we're going to return an object where we have done set to false and value set to current. So current will start as whatever the initial value is, in our case 1, and the very first time through we return value of 1. But then we need to make sure to add current, or add to current. So we're going to do current plus equals step. It's not always 1, so we can't do plus plus. We could be doing step of 5, so we're going to plus equals step. But there's a problem with this code. Well, there's a couple. But if we return first, this is never going to happen. We just return, and the function stops. So we need an intermediate variable, or that's one approach at least. So I'm going to make a variable, I'll call this let result, and I'm going to set result equal to that. And then at the end, I'm going to return result. So this is just an intermediate step, so I can have the old value of current. So the first time through the loop, current starts at 1, and we store that here. And then we update current, so it's now 2, and then we return the original value in result. So I'm missing a very important piece, which is I need to make sure at some point done is false, or done is true, excuse me, which is here. Because if current is now greater than end, that means we've hit the end and we're done, so we need to return done. Okay, so let's see if this works. Let's spread the default range, where we don't pass any values in, 1 to 10, step of 1. Now let's go from 1 to 20 in a step of 5, 1, 6, 11, 16, perfect. Let's go from 10 to 200 in multiples of 20. Actually, let's go from 20 to 200. Perfect, 20, 40, 60, 80, and we've created an iterable. This right here returns an iterable, which under the symbol.iterator has a function that returns an iterator. This is the iterator here, and we call that, or our code is calling it behind the scenes. It's calling next over and over and over until it gets done true, at which point it gives up. It's done. So this is not everything there is to know about iterators. For example, there are some other things you can define besides next, which I'm not going to go into now because, quite frankly, this is not something you do all that often. But I think it's kind of a fun peek into some of the internals of JavaScript. It's a nice little window that allows you to change functionality and connect to some of these behind-the-scenes stuff. I don't know. It's not making sense. All right, so we made it to the end, surprisingly. It's kind of a tough one. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it and subscribing. I'm trying to post consistently once or twice a week for the next couple months. Also, leave a comment if you have suggestions for future videos. I've been drawing upon those for each of the last 5 or 6 videos. And I think that's it. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.